We, the leaders of the Arab states. That's the opening line of the resolution adopted by the Arab League during an emergency summit held in Cairo this week to discuss the next steps in Gaza. From the outset, it signals a bold, loud, and unified position that the Arab public has been craving since the war began in October 2023. The Egyptian-led plan lays out a phased reconstruction effort for the war-torn strip that would ensure Palestinians remain on their land throughout the process. It came in response to US President Donald Trump's plan to evict Palestinians outside of Gaza, while the US takes control of the enclave and rebuilds it into a, quote, Riviera. Last month, Trump said he would not impose his plans, and his administration said that they would be open to suggestions if anyone had a, quote, better idea. But both the US and Israel almost instantly shut down the Arab proposal adopted at the summit, saying that the plan fails to address the reality, that Gaza is uninhabitable. They also insist that in order to rebuild, Gaza must be Hamas-free. Egypt's plan proposes a technocratic version of reconstruction in which a Palestinian committee, not affiliated with any political faction, would supervise the rebuilding process and administer public services. This means that Hamas too would have to give up its authority. Yet, this does not seem to measure up to Israel or America's expectations. So what will? This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada AlTaher. In this episode, we analyze the details of the Arab plan for Gaza and bring to light the many obstacles it will have to overcome for a fighting chance to succeed. The National's Hamza Hendawi is based in Cairo and has been reporting on the Egyptian proposal since it was still in the negotiation phase. I asked him what action points stood out as new or significant in the official resolution adopted by the Arab states.
The important point here is that the comments made by the Egyptian president and the comments made by the Palestinian president, they all confirmed what we had for so long attributed to sources. But there are a few new things that we have learned. First, that the international conference that Egypt is calling for to rally financial support for the reconstruction of Gaza is going to take place in Egypt next month. So that is new. And then for the first time, we've learned that the Egyptians and the Jordanians are already training members of the Gaza police force. And for the first time, it was there in black and white. The Egyptians and other Arabs are actually okay with an international peacekeeping force to be deployed in Gaza. We've been hearing about this since those optimistic days when we thought this war would not last for more than a few weeks and ended up lasting 15 months. The idea was not welcomed by many Arab countries because no one wants to get into the Gaza quagmire where you can have Hamas as an enemy and potentially also have Israel as an enemy. But now, according to the Egyptian plan that was adopted by the Arab Summit yesterday, they want the UN Security Council to create such a force.
Break down the details of the plan for us, Hamza. What would reconstruction actually look like? And how practical would it be to implement while Palestinians in Gaza are relocated to these safe zones?
The summit confirmed for the first time how much it will cost, according to the Egyptian plan, to reconstruct Gaza. And the figure is a staggering $53 billion. The communique also said that a fund for the reconstruction of Gaza would be set up in countries across the world, and multinational donors would be encouraged to give money into that fund. There will be 7 safety zones created for Palestinians of Gaza to live in while the construction is underway. I do not believe that the people who will be in those safe zones will be there for the entire duration of the reconstruction, but I think it's going to be done in rotation. But they've also given a figure of more than 1 million Palestinians who will have to be moved to those safe zones. And that is a new element that we've learned from the plan. The plan also has a 6-month initial phase in which basic services will have to be restored for the residents of Gaza. But I think the question is how to implement the plan. It looks great. It's not rocket science to reconstruct a place like Gaza. It is difficult because of the amount of rubble. It is difficult because of the unexploded ordnance. That is not an easy task. But on the whole, it's not rocket science. But for anyone to start giving money to the reconstruction of Gaza, these people who are given money, they need to know that there is a lasting peace in Gaza. So I think the Egyptians and whoever drafted the plan bore that in mind. And that's why the plan has a parallel track of trying to get the Hamas and Israel to negotiate a permanent settlement of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. In my view, that is even more ambitious than the reconstruction plan, given the position of the right-wing government that is in office now in Israel.
The plan also presents a technocratic solution. Do we know if the Arab states got any guarantees from Hamas and Fatah that they would actually be on board with this?
Hamas has already made some major concessions. They have agreed not to be part of the committee that will be set up and run Gaza, a committee of technocrats that we believe will be made up of 20 members. Hamas has also agreed not to have a say in the reconstruction of Gaza. So these are two major concessions made by Hamas. And I think it's smart on the part of Hamas to step aside and let the reconstruction and the running of post-war Gaza in the hands of others. But Hamas has made it very clear at the same time that it will not disarm, and that poses a problem. But the Egyptians have said that if there is a clear path to a two-state solution and concrete steps have been taken in that direction, Hamas might be persuaded to give up its arms. I think Hamas might very well be persuaded to disarm if there is indeed a clear path to Palestinian statehood.
The challenges that stand ahead of the Arab plan are no small feat. Without even looking too far into the future, there's also a constant threat of a war returning to Gaza at any moment as the ceasefire agreement stalls. I spoke about this with Tahani Mustafa, the crisis group's senior Palestine analyst. Tahani, how can discussions around reconstruction go anywhere without a permanent ceasefire in place? Phase 2 of the truce was supposed to be well underway by now, but the parties seem to be stuck in a limbo after Phase 1 expired. Can you talk us through what happened with the ceasefire and where did it all go wrong exactly?
It was pretty clear from the outset that Israel had no intention of indulging Phase 2. Israeli politicians made no secret about that. They were issuing incessant statements, literally undermining the ceasefire proposals. Most regional stakeholders that were involved, most regional mediators, Palestinians themselves were really wary about how far we would actually get in the ceasefire. I don't think many actually expected to get through the first 14 days of the ceasefire, never mind, seeing us to the point where we're at the end of Phase 1. Also, Israel has been implicated in, I think, something like 400 violations, and that includes midway through the first phase refusing to engage in talks around the second phase, right, which was supposed to be part of Phase 1. And now Israel is claiming that, it's put this initiative with the US on the table, an undisclosed initiative, which is an extension of Phase 1, essentially, for another 42 days. And it's effectively blaming Hamas for not accepting that undisclosed initiative that it had no idea about to begin with. And worse yet, you're seeing an international Western media that is not just muted on this, but are effectively, again, toying with semantics to put the blame on Hamas. We've seen the European Union issue a statement quite literally condemning Hamas for starving 2.3, or whatever's left of Gaza's 2.3 million people, because obviously Israel has now blocked aid, all entry of aid, in order to pursue political pressure on Hamas to accept this extension, whereby Israel receives all its hostages and then can resume the war as it sees fit. So, I think at this point, this idea of seeing a Phase 2 out, it's pretty indicative that neither Israel nor its US ally, which really is the strongest state here, if we think about it, that has the most leverage over Israel to rein things in and get a ceasefire in motion, neither of them have any intention to end this, at least not in the short term.
Turning back to the Arab plan that was adopted in Cairo this week, what does this mean for the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, and for the Palestinian leadership in general? Would the Arab states present a plan without already having Palestinian approval?
I don't think they actually sought Palestinian approval. The Palestinian representative there was someone who's literally, his popularity has plummeted so far down. This plan implies that there shouldn't even be any buy-in from Hamas. That's an absolute no-go for Hamas. I mean, and that's also incredibly impractical to have the reinstatement of the PA, but under whose authority? Someone like Hussein al-Sheikh, which is what the implication is if we look at some of the reforms that had been presented at the summit. This is definitely, something that is going to feel, for Palestinians at least, imposed upon them. This is something that's going to receive immense pushback, in terms of like what is being offered in the way of a Palestinian leadership and the reinstatement of a reformed PA. You're effectively offering them the same thing, just with a different face.
What role does Hamas play in all of this? Where would they fit into the future of Gaza if not in a position of power?
Hamas have already said that they're willing to hand over governance, but it needs to have their consent. It needs to have their buy-in. It can't be something imposed. It can't be something that is simply brokered outside of the agreement of the Palestinian political factions. There needs to be some element of legitimacy here. Another no-go is the decommissioning of their weapons, not because they don't want to. I mean, Hamas have already offered in the past, and they even offered back in May 2024 to put down their weapons if Israel could act as a good faith partner in negotiations. Now, we've seen that Israel is not acting in good faith. It is, in fact, acting in bad faith, right? The fact that they have assassinated how many of Hamas's leadership, including the very moderate that they were negotiating with. There have been many instances where Hamas have offered Israel a permanent cessation of hostilities for far less. And we're talking about well before the 7th of October. Obviously, this is something that is always massively underreported, if it's reported at all. This isn't just about Hamas per se. This is about trying to root out any kind of Palestinian pushback or resistance to the status quo. And I think, eventually we're going to start to see a schism, because this idea that Hamas is a non-starter is not a unified international position. We've seen states like Russia, China, there have been numerous states that have tried to broker reconciliation and recognize that you need to have Hamas's buy-in. Any future of Gaza, any future of the Palestinian territories, you can't ignore Hamas. They can either be an obstructor or a facilitator to that process.
So what options do the Arab states have right now? And how do you read this kind of unified Arab movement towards the Palestinian issue?
We've been seeing the Arabs move more towards a unified position, I think, especially since October 2024, when we started to see, regional states like Qatar, Saudi, Turkey, Egypt putting pressure on Hamas to try and be as flexible and to accept practically any proposal that would be put on the table, right? We saw a lot of pressure there. We saw pressure on the Palestinian Authority to figure out a way to reconcile with Hamas so you wouldn't have the kind of conundrum we're in today, where again, you've got the PA brokering on its own plans for Gaza, and then you've got Hamas on the other side. So we'd seen a lot of movement amongst Arab states that were pushing them towards a more unified trajectory, for sure. I think this Arab summit has definitely sort of, at least symbolically, cemented that. But again, I think this is more to do with their own domestic concerns and interests rather than, rallying around a particular cause, right? I think for the first time in a long time, they finally see synergy in their own sort of domestic national interests. The impact of the Gaza war has been considerable, is going to be considerable on states like Saudi, on states like Egypt, Jordan. We're seeing the effects now on Syria, Lebanon. So I think for all of those involved, we definitely saw a unified position, but it wasn't, the region is not homogenous in its position on this. I mean, Algeria refused to attend this. And to be quite frank, even those that are, really frontlining this, I mean, these are effectively US satellite states. They're so heavily dependent on US financial and security assistance for their own survival that it's very unlikely that they're going to do anything that could really kind of sidestep, disgruntle their US ally.
Ever wondered what it feels like to be a gladiator, facing a roaring crowd and potential death in the Colosseum? Find out on the Ancients podcast from History Hit. Twice a week, join me, Tristan Hughes, as I hear exciting new research about people living thousands of years ago, from the Babylonians to the Celts to the Romans, and visit the ancient sites which reveal who and just how amazing our distant ancestors were. That's the Ancients from History Hit.
One of the biggest challenges for the Arab Gaza plan to work is the US position. So what would be an Arab reconstruction plan that President Trump would actually get on board with?
None. As long as he is taking his cue from Prime Minister Netanyahu, he is not going to accept an Arab reconstruction plan.
That's Hussein Ibish, senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington and a columnist for The National.
And the biggest problem with any Arab reconstruction plan, from the point of view of Netanyahu, is that Palestinian politics are binary. One power center is Hamas, and the other power center is Fatah. The PLO, the PA is controlled by Fatah. The international community is unanimous. Everyone, even Hamas, recognizes the PLO as the diplomatic voice of the Palestinians. Because Palestinian politics are so binary and so dualistic, if you're going to have a Palestinian anything, it's either going to favor Hamas and strengthen Hamas or Fatah. Simple as that. You can strengthen neither by excluding Palestinians altogether. That happens all the time. But if you're going to include the Palestinians, you have to choose. And you can call it anything you like. You can call it a committee of technocrats, or you can call it a national consensus, or you can call it anything you want to. But either it's going to strengthen Hamas or it's going to strengthen Fatah. So Netanyahu prefers Hamas. Simple as that. In Gaza, he wants Hamas to come back to power. The Arabs have a plan. Trump has a plan. Now, the question is this: does Netanyahu have a plan?
Does Netanyahu have a plan?
Yes, and we see it in action now. It is playing itself out in real time during phase one of the ceasefire. Netanyahu clearly wants, and it makes perfect sense, to return to a modified version of the status quo ante. He has not revised his general approach to Palestinians. Over the past 20 years, it has been divide and rule. Hamas in Gaza, but surrounded, contained, and subjected to wars every now and then, which they called mowing the grass, keeping them weak, literally cutting them down to size. And Fatah through the PA and the PLO in power in Area A of the West Bank. So Smotrich and Ben Gvir were kept away from the war in Gaza and the war in Lebanon, but as compensation, they were given control over the West Bank. The Netanyahu plan is this: Hamas comes back to power in Gaza, but always subjected to constant warfare, whether light or heavy or whatever, keeps the Palestinians divided, keeps Hamas in power, but he can say we never accept them and have a war, and it's just perfect for him. And Smotrich said it out loud. He said the quiet part out loud. Hamas is an asset, and the PLO is the enemy. Okay, why? Because Fatah and the PLO and the PA could create a Palestinian state under the right circumstances. Hamas is too radioactive and too extreme, and also it's not even their project to create a Palestinian state. So the Israeli right fears the Palestinians who want to talk to Israelis and make a peaceful deal with Israelis more than they fear the Palestinians want to kill and kidnap Israelis.
So that's what Netanyahu wants. What does President Trump want?
Trump has never been a two-state solution guy. I think Trump has a vision for the Palestinians. Trump wants to make a deal. He never made a good deal. He has no record as a deal maker, either internationally or at home. He needs a big deal. He wants a Nobel Prize. He wants to say he's smarter than Obama. It's there in writing from January 2020. Peace to Prosperity plan cooked up by Jared Kushner said Israel should annex 30 to 40% of the remaining West Bank, including the Jordan Valley. What this would do is encircle the little Palestinian area remaining, totally encircled, in a greater Israel, now formalized, recognized by the United States. So the Palestinians can call it a state or get angry and call it nothing. They can dismantle the PA. They can do whatever they want. Doesn't matter. The Israelis can wait and take it later. They're surrounding it anyway. So this way, I think Trump is thinking of annexation in the West Bank as a compensation to Israel and its American friends for a nuclear deal with Iran, which he wants, the Iranians want, he can get, and it will make them angry, but they're in no position to stop him. They couldn't stop Obama, so they can't stop him. He has to give them something. This is it.
Even if this is President Trump's ultimate ambition, why would an Arab reconstruction plan in Gaza interfere with that? Does it get in the way of his own objectives?
No, I don't think it does. I think these are unconnected problems, right? I think he's deferring to Netanyahu.
Do you think that there's anything that the Arab states can come up with that will convince Trump to come around and pressure Israel to accept a reconstruction plan?
So there are a couple of sticking points. They're not saying they'll pay for the whole thing. That's a problem. He wants them to say they'll pay for everything. They're not saying the Americans should pay anything. They're not saying the Israelis should pay anything. They're saying they'll pay, the Europeans will pay, or the Japanese will pay. Not good enough. He wants to hear from the Gulf countries that they will pay. But the point is this, unless they said that up front, he's not going to like it. Number two, they have a big problem about what to do about Hamas, right? Not Hamas, the leaders, because Hamas leadership in Gaza is dead. The rest are cadres. The rest are just men with guns, right? So what the Arabs are cognizant of, that Trump maybe is not cognizant of, and that the Israelis know all too well, but they want to use this and play games with it, is the Iraq experience, where the Iraqi army is disbanded and you send everybody home with no job, but a lot of guns and a lot of ammunition and military training. They become Al-Qaeda, and eventually it morphs into ISIS and Daesh under al-Baghdadi. And this is, so they don't want to make this mistake. So what they want to do is have a kind of a program to make these people, and it's in the plan, but it's very subtly phrased, is to get these people into a police force or some other security service run by Fatah or a Fatah-related thing, so they can keep their jobs, and there would be a police, and there would be a security, and a lot of them are going to be former Hamas, but they're not going to be led by Hamas, and they're going to have to not do Hamas kind of things, and do instead police kind of things and border security kind of things. Now, a lot of Israelis will say, no way, every Hamas member has to die. And, the United States is not ready to hear this because it's a complicated matter that the Americans are not thinking about.
Is there an understanding among Arab states that they will eventually need the US to come around in order to execute any rebuilding efforts? And are we going to see some sort of negotiations phase next between Arab states and the US, do you think?
You do need the Americans to come around because only Trump can shift Netanyahu from continuing to implement his vision for Gaza. So, yeah, it's necessary for the Arabs to negotiate with Trump, for sure, because he's the only one who could do it. The problem is the Arab states all have their own priorities, right? And Gaza is a priority for Egypt and to some extent for Jordan because of the way it influences the West Bank. It's not the number one priority for any of the Gulf countries, not even Qatar, which takes the keenest interest. So they care about Palestine. They want to do the right thing, but they're countries. They have to prioritize in what they do. So when it comes to the Americans, they're going to negotiate their own requirements first.
Reconstruction is something that is imminently needed. It's needed yesterday. From where we stand today, do you think that it will happen anytime soon?
I see no sign of it. I think the Israeli plan, as I said, the Netanyahu plan is to keep the status quo exactly as it is. They live as they live now, hand to mouth and with aid and in utter misery. Now, this is the second part of the Israeli plan. The Israelis have criticized the Arab proposal and praised the Trump proposal on the grounds, and this is the specific grounds. They said Gazans need to be free to live where they want. In other words, they want them to self-deport. They want to make life so miserable that Palestinians can't take it, and they leave Gaza. They want them to have this little toehold in this tiny corner of their country. They want to force them through misery to leave and go to Canada or Australia or Sweden or Botswana or anywhere other than Palestine. They want to drive them out. But first, they wanted to drive them out into Egypt. The Egyptians made it very clear, no, there's nowhere else other than Egypt they can push them, except in small groups, individually. They want the Palestinians of Gaza to perform. They want them to go out of the need to live. They want to make it literally uninhabitable.
That's it for Beyond the Headlines this week. For more news and analysis on the Arab states' reconstruction plan for Gaza, visit thenationalnews.com. This episode was produced by Ben Barqawi and audio engineered by Arthur Edison. Yasmin Altaji is our assistant producer, and Da'a Farid is our editor, and I'm your host, Nada AlTaher. Thank you for listening.